So the topic of the presentation is to introduce the idea of serendipity in participatory budgeting. So I'm going to start first to describe you what I mean by participatory budgeting, define participatory budgeting, and then I will introduce the idea of serendipity and why I think it's an important and somewhat under-discussed issue in participatory budgeting. There are growing discussion about serendipity in design, in particular design of technology, but there is not much discussion about serendipity in democratic innovation or participatory budgeting. So let's start with participatory budgeting. We don't really have a definition of participatory budgeting. There are a few definitions, but in general, most people now identify participatory budgeting discussing its phases. And so there is a general umbrella definition that says that participatory budgeting is a process to engage and increase the number of citizens that can discuss a budget. But that obviously it's a very vague and general definition. So we add to such definition a series of additional elements. First of all, the phases. So the typical participatory budgeting process starts with the first phase. That's the phase of design of the process. Then there is an ideation phase. Then there is a phase that we can call filtering, but some people call voting, in which the best ideas are selected. And then there is a monitoring phase. Many people do not include the monitoring phase in participatory budgeting, but I think it's very important to include. Otherwise, we talk only about what we call the first cycle of participatory budgeting. So the moment from the design to the identification of the winner projects and the inclusion of the budget. And we don't talk instead about the second part that is as important. So how you're gonna implement the procurement system, how you're gonna implement the various ideas and transform the budget in a concrete expenditure and in a concrete project. A lot of the Brazilian participatory budgeting, for example, had a lot of issues in the second cycle. A lot of them failed because a number of projects were never implemented. And so it's really important to pay attention to this second cycle. Different model of participatory budgeting emphasize different phases more or less. Another important element to consider when we discuss participatory budgeting is the type of budget we're talking about. So the initial processes did not set aside a certain amount of money. And they basically were a discussion about ideas. More modern processes have started to be really clear and transparent of the amount of budget that is devoted to the process. And there are trade-offs between the two choices because often the budget is not enough to support big ideas. If you think about the typical $1 million type of budget that the participatory budgeting project in the US ask to cities to start a project, that's a very little budget. You cannot do big capital spending with those. You're limited to very little project beautification projects, so on and so forth. So the old style Brazilian system that did not talk about the money at all and let people discuss any type of project they wanted had the advantage of stimulate the fantasy of people, let them even talk about very big projects. But then there was obviously the realization during the review phase when you actually have to put a price on the project that those projects were impossible. So a first trade-off to consider was the type of budget. The second one is where the participatory budgeting is implemented. It started primarily at the city level and the district level. Then we saw a scaling up to the state level We have a few national processes now. And then more and more organizations started adopting it, trade unions, schools, and prisons. Now we had a few prisons having participatory budgeting. Obviously, where you implement participatory budgeting, it changes a lot. The last element, and now I'm going to finish this sort of boring introduction, but I wanted to give you the language I use for participatory budgeting because it's slightly different from other people, is the idea of democratic goods. When we evaluate participatory budgeting, we often look at three very important goods that we want the process to develop. The first one is inclusion. And there are going to be different mechanisms to recruit people to participate in each of the phases of participatory budgeting. And so depending on the mechanism, you're going to generate different type of inclusion level. The second one is popular control. And so on which phases we are giving the participants control. Are we starting to even design the process together with the participants? Or we are giving a pre-designed tool, and often when you are in a digital space, you're forced to do that because the participants do not have the technical skill to redesign the process. Are you giving control over the decision of which project will be implemented? Some participatory budgeting process, in particular the first generation in Germany, was purely consultative. People were just giving ideas, and then the city council was choosing which one to implement. Or the opposite, you're not giving control over the ideation phase. You're giving control over the selection of the processes. And so it becomes closer to a sort of referendum in which the city is providing a series of projects and the citizens are choosing which one to implement. Or are you giving popular control on the entire, even the idea of doing participatory budgeting or not? So this is the second democratic good we'll look at. The third one is what we call considerate judgment. This, by the way, were introduced by Graham Smith in a really famous book in 2009. By considerate judgment, we mean the design elements of any participatory or deliberative processes, in our case is participatory budgeting, that promote the careful consideration of ideas, they promote deliberation. So, for example, let's imagine the typical ideation phase of a participatory budgeting. In many cases, the ideation phase is mostly left to the citizen themselves. That was the traditional way in Brazil. And many other typical European processes do that. But in other cities, for example, Antwerp in Belgium, and in some other processes that adapt the technique of deliberative polling, in the ideation phase, there is a really curated deliberation phase in which you have small group discussion with moderators, in which the participants discuss the pros and cons of all the projects, not just theirs. And they do a series of exercises to consider even the impact of their project on the common good. For example, we did one process like that in Germany, in Wuppertal. And so this is very different from the typical Brazilian approach, in which the project was designed by a group of citizens or a civil society organization. And so that group of citizens only thought about their project. They didn't think about the pros and cons of other projects. They didn't refine their project. And so these are three important elements that we analyze when looking at the family and variety of participatory budgeting. I'm going to stop here. I hope I gave you my point of view and the language I'm going to use in this presentation. In the second part of the presentation now, I want to talk about a little bit of the dangers of the design of these participatory budgeting process or any type of democratic innovation. As you saw from my introduction, Anytime we design one of these processes, we have a set of normative goals in mind. For example, we want to promote inclusion, we want to promote more voice of participants, we want to promote more transparency. In order to do so, the organizer often, even in collaboration with a subset of the participants, design a process. This process is a series of tasks that need to be completed. And so the risk of this type of approach is that the participants feel managed. And so instead of promoting autonomy in the participants, instead of promoting critical thinking, we risk to manage them like herding sheep through a process that will generate the outcome that we desire. So that is an important issue to recognize in any type of design of participatory processes. And participatory budgeting was actually one of the first processes that recognized this problem. And so in Brazil, till the early days, after the end of the participatory process, they were meeting to discuss and evaluate how the process went and to propose changes to the process. So the most standard solution to prevent this sort of paternalistic approach in which we are herding participants instead of making sure that they own the process, that they grow within the process, that their critical thinking and ability to control of the process increase. So the first solution was to purely increase popular control. And so the standard design of the Brazilian approach had an end of a year meeting of redesigning the process. That was an interesting starting point, and obviously it's an important, it's an interesting approach. As in all things, it is another task that you're adding to the participants. And so it is a novel participatory process. It's a meta participatory process in which you design the participatory budgeting. And so it's only a partial solution because it can become itself another task to complete. It goes in the correct direction, but it also comes with its own risk. For example, some of the research they did in Porto Alegre showed that through these mechanisms, the participants manipulated the process to eliminate the turnover rules for representative of the participatory budgeting. The specific model in Porto Alegre was a model that is probably not so familiar now, given that we are mostly familiar with the modern European and North American model that doesn't have elected representatives. But in Brazil, each region of the city, in Porto Alegre, for example, elected a certain number of representatives. And those representatives were the ones that were doing most of the work, were the ones that were proposing the projects, were the ones that were ranking the project. Then people were going back to vote over them. But a lot of the work was done by this representative. And in particular, there was a city level group that had the most power, that actually directed the funding to the various regions. There was the COP, the Consiglio di Orçamento Participativo. And that group had a rule that you could be part of the group only for 2 years. And then you were supposed to step down to promote more turnover. So one of the things that was changed through this meta design was to remove and weaken the rule. And so we need to somehow, some of these solutions that promote more control to the cities also might carry their own issues and problems. So another solution that you might have encountered, because this comes from game design, is the idea of introducing meaningful inefficiencies. There was a famous book by Eric Gordon that applied to a variety of participatory processes, but also it was applied to participatory budgeting. The idea of meaningful inefficiencies is the idea of introducing off-task spaces in your participatory design. There could be social spaces, there could be spaces with side activities. I don't know, in a typical online forum that is supposed to discuss politics and propose ideas about, I don't know, policy, it would be a space to discuss about soccer or to discuss about your favorite music. And you have for sure encountered those spaces. The idea of those spaces is to create, first of all, obviously, they generate group cohesion, because people are working on something that it's purely on their terms, something about their leisure, their interest, and it's not related to the task. But second, the idea is that often in those spaces, we have found that the best ideas are generated, paradoxically, is when people are working off task. Maybe if it's a face-to-face participatory budgeting, you have a dinner after the ideation phase, people go discuss and they come up with a new idea, and so on and so forth. So this is the idea of not focusing too much, not being too strict about the task that you have, introducing some sort of interesting activities around it. Brazilian participatory budgeting had proto-example of these, because the regional meetings in Porto Alegre and in other cities were often connected to parties. There were like art exhibition, maybe a movie was screened, there was a concert. And so there was a creation of a social tissue around the meeting in which the participants were coming to discuss ideas. The last point that I'm making, and then I want to open to discussion if there are questions, or I'm happy to talk more about some of these issues, is the idea of serendipity, that it's now a catchphrase. It's emerging a lot in design. And so the idea of serendipity is at the basic level, is the idea of a chance encounter with new ideas that you have not thought about. And obviously, if you think about social media and echo chambers, it's becoming more and more difficult to do that, because due to the algorithmic propaganda, the way the platform are designed, we are feeded content that has been profiled for us. So it's very difficult to encounter content that we find different from our point of view, that we find challenging. And the same might be in a participatory budgeting process, particularly a participatory budgeting process that is open to all, and thus engages only a certain subset of the population. It's already politically active, that maybe has a similar profile of ideas, that's not very different. This probably is less of a big problem in an organization like a school, if everybody participates. But if you think about a typical participatory budgeting inside a city, it is a big problem, because if the city government is, I don't know, progressive, most probably the participant in the PB process would be progressive too. And so that will limit the possibility of encountering point of view that are radically different from our own. Most of the participants in the PB process, or whatever other innovation like a citizen assembly or something else, they would be very similar to us. And so one of the, that limits serendipity. So one of the first design principles when we're trying to design to promote serendipity is, again, to strengthen inclusion, not just inclusion of type of people, but also inclusion of different ideas. And it might be sometimes very difficult. So some scholars have proposed to rediscover a really old deliberation mechanism that actually traces back to Buddhist monastery and also Catholic monastery, that it's the devil advocate. So in Catholic monastery, they had this doctrine discussion, and one of the participants was taking the role of the devil on purpose, and so he was representing the point of view of the devil, so that he would be constantly challenging everybody else, constantly challenging their point of view and their understanding of what they were talking about. And so you can imagine the introduction of devil advocate type of devices inside of the deliberation moment. So, for example, in a participatory budgeting, those moments in which we discuss the pros and cons of different projects, we could include a devil advocate moment. Others have proposed to promote randomized content. So let's imagine, for example, the voting phase. In a participatory budgeting, you're entering your platform, maybe it's a digital vote. Usually they're just displayed by some sort of topological criterion. For example, you select, I don't know, the district of the city, and there are all the projects in alphabetical order, so on and so forth. Instead, some people have proposed to use a sort of recommendation that is based on random selection. And so you might have friends that invited you to vote for their project, but you will also be exposed to a random set of projects. That there is no specific criteria that is not targeted to your profile, your location, or your interest. It's purely random. And so that will promote the chance encounter with other point of views. And there are a number of other devices. There is an entire literature that you can look at for designing for serendipity. But some people, and I kind of agree with them, think that it's kind of defeat the purpose of the idea of serendipity if we can design for it. And instead, the idea of adopting a serendipity style of participatory democracy, it's more a curiosity approach from the organizer. The idea of letting things happen, and when something goes wrong, actually observe what went wrong, discuss with the participants, slow down, and not be focused too much on the task. And so in a lot of the processes that I have implemented, by doing this, by observing what the participants were doing, by slowing down, maybe even pausing the process, we discover new approaches. One of the things that we implemented that came out in a citizen assembly, that was not a participatory budgeting process, it was a slightly different design, a consultative process, that was not going very well because the experts that were coming to talk to the participants were very vocal. The participant didn't feel very included. One of the participants started protesting, and they suggested this idea of speed dating the expert. So the expert would not have 20 minutes to talk, but they will have 5 minutes to talk, then a gong will ring, and they will move around the small group discussion. This was an idea from basically a disgruntled participant that was really annoyed. And the participant loved it, and we implemented it, and now we adopted it. It's actually, now it's adopted by many people. This was like 20 years ago when we did it. And I'm sure that other people figure it out by themselves. But this is an example. So the idea is not much to design for serendipity, but be ready for it. I think I'm gonna stop here, and I'm gonna start taking questions if anybody has questions about the variety of participatory budgeting. Was the first part of the presentation, the risk of herding the participants over design, the fact that we might actually limit autonomy if we are designing the process and we're focusing too much on the task. And the last part, this idea of trying to think outside the box, try to promote maybe via the design serendipity, autonomy of the participants, and maybe the fact that that is impossible, and that instead it's more an act of curiosity on the side of the organizers.
I actually have two questions, and they're not really well related. So I'm going to start with one and then we'll move to the next. And the first one touches on something that I believe you mentioned at the beginning of your discussion related to issues with PB cycles where the funds were not necessarily sectioned out at the time of the inception of the PB cycle, right? Can you touch on that? Can you touch on what exactly happened there?
That was actually the standard. The model of setting aside the money comes when participatory budgeting comes back to Europe. And in particular, it becomes dominant with the participatory budgeting in North America. Before, all the Latin American approach did not set aside the money. In part because there was this rhetoric that they were trying to push that the entire budget of the city was decided via participatory budgeting in the best practices. It was never true. It was purely rhetoric, and it was an engagement approach. It was very helpful for engagement, but it also generated all the literature about the mismanagement of expectation. You might have heard this. The only rule we have about participatory budgeting is that you should not mismanage the expectation of the participants. That was Giovanni Allegretti rule of PB. And that was based on all the failures, like because in Brazil, there were lots of participatory budgeting. Many of them died at the end of the first or the second year, exactly because they overpromised, they couldn't deliver, and so on and so forth. And so when it comes to Europe, in a situation in which also there is less political support for the process, because in Brazil there was very strong political support. It was a strategy of a larger strategy to win actually the national government. It comes in a situation in which the cities have very little money. Maybe they can put only 100,000 euros. At the time, it was even before euros. So they have to be very clear with the participants on the scope, because they cannot discuss the entire redevelopment of a square. Like one of the first projects of Porto Alegre was the entire redevelopment of the central square. And instead, they discuss mostly beautification projects, small brick and mortar things, redoing the dog park, this and that. And so that's where the trade-off lies. If you're willing and you have the political clout to engage the participants on ideas, big ideas, you have a huge result on engagement, but you carry the risk of them not being able to actually implement. If instead you set aside the money, often the money is very little. Even the typical $1 million, when it's divided in small projects, the participants, at least the sophisticated one, immediately realize that you can do nothing with it. Like nothing really important. You can do the bench, you can do the redoing of the park, you can do little things, but it's immediately redesigned as a sort of democratic game, not a real meaningful. You cannot restructure the traffic pattern of a city with the participatory budget, right? You can only do very small projects. For that reason, for example, the typical German-style participatory budgeting defends the fact that they are not setting aside the money, they are not having a voting, and it's purely consultative, because they claim it's the only way to engage in big ideas. Otherwise, the citizens adapt because they have agency, and they only propose a small project, but depending on the budget, it could be smaller or bigger project, but in general, relatively small project. So some people view the lack of a set-aside budget as a always bad thing. It's not always bad. It depends what you're trying to do, because again, when the budget is small, it sets the tone of the process, and in some situation, when you have the political cloud, like the golden age of Porto Alegre, the entire investment of the city, or at least 30–40%, were done via PB. And so there was no need to set the budget because also the city raised taxes, the city borrowed money. And so if you are in that golden age situation in which there is a huge political support for the PB process, you're not just talking about expenditures, you're talking about revenues too. And that escalates. But all that has kind of disappeared, right? In all the modern PB processes, they have been packaged. Now there is a sort of like commodified version of participatory budgeting that it's really easy to replicate, but has lost a little bit that radical original idea that also required a very big administrative reform. There is a famous paper by Ganuzzo e Baiocchi, published in 2013, that explain how the fast diffusion of participatory budgeting around the world was due to its sort of plasticity and the fact that it was vague. And so everybody renamed whatever participatory process they wanted as participatory budgeting. And the second lesson of that paper is that we have lost the administrative reform component and redistribution component. Those were the two original elements coming from Latin America. Participatory budgeting was a device to do something else. The objective was not doing participatory budgeting. The device was to reform the administration, was to make it more transparent, reduce corruption. And in that case, there was a very strong social justice element. So they really wanted to give more money to poor people. They were coming out from a dictatorship that mostly catered to the middle and upper class, and they had an entire section of the city that had never seen a public investment. And so the slogan of Porto Alegre and the first 13 cities where we're going to give voice to those that do not have voice. And so it was very, very different, for example, the Chinese model of participatory budgeting that uses random sampling of the population. Because random sampling, the idea there is everybody should have the same voice.
Sure.
And instead, no, the original Brazilian model is no, the middle and upper class already are having their voice through other channels. We are creating something for those that have nothing. Now it's very difficult to do those things. It's not the same political climate. Even the fact that they were reweighting the vote with a metric of need. So there was this matrix that was called the budgeting matrix orçamentária, the budgeting matrix. It was based on like poverty index at the district level. And so on top of the voting of the people that were choosing different projects, for the allocation of money, there was also a reweighting. So basically your vote counted more if you were coming from a poor neighborhood. And that is very difficult now to implement. You probably not fly. It's almost anti-democratic. Yeah. And it's a technocratic element. I hope I answered the first question.
And I mean, with color, amazingly. And that actually turns out that maybe my second question does fall in line. You talked about anti-democratic and this component there. There does become, there's a section of PB that I often kind of throws some flags for me for a section of possible unfairness. And that is where we are selecting the proposals that are voted for, right? Because that, creating the ballot, right? Can you talk about, the lessons you've learned in maybe ballots are too big, right? And we can't, maybe voting for 1,000 different proposals isn't realistic for a population. Maybe we have to pare it down to proposals that, a certain number that people can even fit into their mind. Maybe we have to pare the proposals down to ones that are possible. Well, okay, now we're deciding what's possible. Well, it's easy if you define a budget. You can say, well, it's within this scope of the budget possibly, but there's this whole component here where, you know, there's the ideation process and then there's the voting, and there is a gate between the two. And managing that process, ensuring transparency and fairness as you bring proposals from side A to side B.
It's really, really hard, right? And so the European style, and now it's becoming the most prevalent, is to have a double voting, basically. The first one is just a like up and like down. So they just sidestep the problem, downloading the issue on the participants. Then the participants get sometimes annoyed. We can come to you, why do I have to do the electoral campaign again? Right, that's what happened in Milan 2017. The people worked really hard to get the like up in the first part, got on the ballot, and then the vote was open to everybody and said, but we have to do it again 6 months later. The other approach is the budget delegates. It's fairly common. You have these people that propose themselves, or in Brazil were elected, and they are the one that do the job. The other approach is purely the city. The city is choosing, and that we have observed that. The other approach is this deliberative model, in which you have a face-to-face, I guess it could be done online too, but in which the group are allowed, for example, to rank all the projects about their own. And then you have a sort of structured selection process that tries to be fair. And so but in general, it is an issue. I get my take, and it's the conclusion of my talk, is this idea of serendipity approach to these things. I don't think these are political problems. I don't think there is a design solution to political problems. There is not. Otherwise, we will have already solved all our problems, right? If it's not code. When you have this type of political problems, they're going to be winner and losers. And the only way, if the project is repeated, if it's not repeated, you are in trouble. But if the project is a yearly project, at that point, the only way is really to listen to the participants and try to update whatever you have done that year, the subsequent year, and really empower them. And then they're going to choose, right? They're going to have the agency. At a certain moment, they're going to realize what they can obtain with participatory budgeting and what they can't. And participatory budgeting is only one instrument. There are many others. And so I think that's my personal take on these issues. There is no solution. And if somebody tells there is one, it's just hard. It's one of the challenging things. Because that's again, it's like the vote. The vote is the same. It's problematic too, because changing the voting system or immediately changes the result. And obviously, as much as we repeat ourselves, the new approach is really catered to citizens. Social movements and organized groups have such an edge in the voting process. And so that's another issue for participatory budgeting, that it's really hard that the single citizens propose a project. Even if it's the most amazing project, it is a beauty contest in the end. The person with the most friends, or if it's most organized, wins. And so that's why I think this serendipity idea, it's important to keep in mind, this curiosity, and keep listening basically to the participants and change. And even
part of that.
Sorry.
So this is really fascinating. I'm going to jump in and see if I can build on Clint. And first, I'm so thankful that you're here with us. I'm really excited about the work that you're doing and sharing with us. It's very exciting. I've actually been doing participatory budgeting here in the U.S. for a decade, since 2010 in San Jose, California. And one of the things that I found was, well, there's actually two things that I'd like you to comment on. First, our experience was that everyone needed to build trust in the process, not only the elected officials, but the but the residents of San Jose itself. So for the first 3 years, it was advisory only before the city allocated money. And we worked with the city, where the city created all the content. Because what I wanted to do was, even though it wasn't direct control of money, the city had a commitment to act on the citizens' feedback. And so the projects were very big, and the amount of budget that we were dealing with relative to other PV programs was very big. We actually got over $145 million of potential changes in the budget on the ballots given to the residents, but it was still the city's staff. Like, we are willing to make these changes. And the way that we did it was that we created a slight variation in the process where we called it the red sheets and the green sheets. So at a table of citizens, you had 2 pieces of paper. The red sheet represented an agreed upon budget cut that would then create funds for the table to invest in a green sheet. So the citizens had to, and the city said, look, we're not going to generate any money. We're not going to create new taxes. You are welcome to cut these programs if you so desire. And from the cutting of these programs, you would create money, because that's what we have to do as city officials. And what we found was that the citizens actually did make some significant cuts. I'll give you 2 examples that the citizens did, and the city subsequently implemented. First, they cut the police helicopter, because what they found was that the police helicopter was merely chasing criminals, creating high-speed car chases that were very unsafe. And it wasn't materially increasing safety. It was just, it made the city residents very nervous at night, because you'd see these helicopters flying around with spotlights and people were trying to escape. And there was even a death from a car crash. The second thing was the legal requirement for the number of firemen in a fire truck in our part of the world is 4, but the city had 5. And the city said, look, if you remove the number, if you go to the standard of just 4 people in the fire truck, you're going to save millions of dollars. And the residents said, yes, remove that fire person and allocate the money here. So there's 2 parts of that. The first is, does your opinion change when the process has been repeated year after year after year? Because our experience is that it does take a few times to build the requisite level of trust in the process.
So yeah, the evolution of participatory budgeting process is a fascinating topic. So from my understanding, you started with a more consultative process, and then you move to a more empowered one. So you were on a trajectory of expansion. And the initial one was, in a sense, similar to other consultative processes. And so trajectory of expansion are always positive trajectory. There are lots of examples of trajectory of shrinkage, in which you start with a very nice participatory budgeting. It lasts for 4, 6, 8 years, and then it shrinks down. We also have results that say that starting with the consultative process, it's often dangerous, because it's probably the most fragile one, because people get really annoyed if nothing happens, to simplify. But for example, in Portugal, there was an initial wave around 2000 of many cities doing participatory budgeting in a consultative manner, and a couple that were not. They actually had a budget implemented. And when the financial crisis hit in 2008, all the consultative one died, even if they had no money. And only the one that had implemented things continue. And so there are trajectory of expansion and trajectory of reduction. One of the interesting results is that when you achieve your maximum, because there is a glass ceiling, right? There is a maximum design with respect to the amount of money you can devote to the process, the political will that you have, the support from the citizens, there are lots of ingredients, but usually there is a sort of maximum without doing a revolution that you achieve. When you are there, the literature from Brazil, that's actually my dissertation research, shows that after 8 years, you're often in trouble. And even if you have done the best possible practice, it's really hard to continue it after 8 years. There is sort of fatigue, things changes, the politician don't find it anymore as particularly helpful. And it's interesting, maybe that was a particular case of Brazil, of the political dynamics of Brazil. We don't have the same results in other places yet, in part because we don't have 35 years of data.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that you talk about is fatigue, and I think that this is really interesting. I know we're getting near the end of the talk, but I think that the hidden benefit of serendipity that you're talking about is partly the benefits that you've talked about, but I actually think that the benefit of serendipity is also the fact that it keeps the process fresh. Right? If you think about just basic human relationships, right? How do you maintain a friendship for a lifetime? How you do things, but they're a little different. How do you retain a pair bond between two humans? Right? You find ways to do things that are a little different, so that it has an air of difference. And I think that this is something that we did in San Jose, California, was we actually would run retrospectives. And I know that that's part of the PB process in many places. And those retrospectives would feed back, let's try this, under the assumption that there was no static process. But in fact, by trying things, we kept people engaged and interested and excited to continue to come back.
Yeah, other cities have moved to 2 or 3 year cycles when it became more mature. Other cities have paused and maybe have done a long-term zoning plan, like a different, very big participatory process. There was more about the big problem of the city without money attached to it. But there's still, like, at least in Brazil, they have to do that every 4 years. And so that's called the multi-year plan of the city. Basically, when a new mayor comes in, they have to do it. And so they have done that. So there are, but in part, there is what I call a sort of glass ceiling, right? These things, when they are successful, they grow so fast because there is a positive cycle, right? More people participate, there is more interest, more money is put, that they reach a sort of ceiling because no more can be done without really entering the way democracy works at the city level. And so at that point, they bump into the ceiling, and that's the moment in which potentially we need to reinvent, we need to change. Maybe we need to pause the process a bit. We need to think about something else. Some process never reach that point. But that's an interesting, basically, if you look at the 35 now years of participatory budgeting in Brazil, the longest PB process was 16 years. Most of them died after 8. We don't have the number yet for North America, but we have similar numbers for Portugal. And so these are very fragile processes. And so I think thinking from the beginning, now that we have this data, this information, thinking from the beginning that this process might die and have a plan B, there are lots of useful things to think about now that this data is coming online. And also not having some sort of like shock if the process changes, become consultative, is not the end of the world, or if it changes in some part or something else. But I've been talking a lot. So,
you're talking to people who want to hear you, because this is exciting. Okay. This is exciting stuff. We live and breathe PB, and we see it in all walks of of both public and private, decision making. I know we've got to get ready for our next talk, so I'm going to just say we are really thankful that you joined us, certainly some of the history that you provided was new to me, and I like to think that I've read a lot of these papers and a lot of this stuff, so it was quite enjoyable listening to some of these changes. If you had to, I'm just going to add one final thing about the recommendation. Our mission is to use participatory budgeting in schools to specifically teach financial literacy so that kids have a actual responsibility to, when they have a proposal, to figure out its cost and, is it operating expense, is it a capital expense, and do you have a full line item, and have you thought through the implementation? And the full expectation on our side as parents and educators is the kids aren't always going to get it right. And that's okay. There's going to be some mistakes. On the civic side, we also have a curriculum that we're building that is designed to talk about engagement and the notion of being a citizen within a democracy itself. If you were the king and you had one thing that you felt had to be taught in the civics curriculum, what would be the one thing that you would most want us to honor about these processes?
I think I really like, that article. Again, the only issue, that article is like for research level, so it's not this school level. But I think it's an important article to keep in mind for those that approach PB in these modern times. I started 30 years ago, so I started in 2001, not 30, but close to 20. So is that article I mentioned by Ganuzza Baiocchi that really talks about diffusion and these changes over time, and the fact that we have lost this idea about social justice and administrative reform that were clearly embedded in the original model. I think that's an interesting reflection to have, because a lot of the modern participatory budgeting have become a sort of game that you just go through the steps, but it doesn't really push you to reflect widely about the budget of the city. One of the things that I always insist is to have a class not just about the participatory budgeting. In most cases, they just teach you, like the first day, okay, you have this money, capital budget, and you have to propose this type of project, not that ones. Instead, what's interesting is to have a class about the city budget, explain that the language of participatory budgeting is a fictional language, that it needs to be translated in the real language of the budget. And that translation is another weak point of participatory budgeting. Many cities have issues at that moment because the PB has his own very simplified language, and then you have to actually find the money from 72 different sources, place it in different programs, break down the project so the one goes under parks, the other one goes under to finance them. And so I think that learning is interesting for both sides, right? I think that the language of the budget should be slowly simplified. It makes no sense, it's so complex. And at the same time, maybe over time, the most active citizens in a participatory budgeting should be able to learn that other language so that the projects are more efficient and work better in collaboration with the city. At the school level, it's very difficult because the kids are learning something that I think it's already provided by simply doing the exercise. What I like to do with kids when we're working in high schools, it's actually teach through failures. Sometimes there is this idea that you want to have a very engagement and sort of party-like process. And instead we experimented sometimes of like increasing the difficulty of some tasks. and actually generating failures on purpose so that they reflect on why things are going wrong and why bringing things a little bit from hacker pedagogy. It's the idea of basically dealing with problems in your own way when they emerge, connects to serendipity, because otherwise if the process is really smooth, it always works. Again, yeah, it's fun, they learn something, but I think there is a deeper learning that happens when things break down. We use it a lot with bureaucrats in Italy, but also at a certain moment when there was the switch to online tools, everybody wanted to use online voting. And so we developed one of these games, a simulation of participatory budgeting with online voting. And it was, most of the bureaucrats could not vote with their mobile phone because they could not figure it out how to use the QR code. And if they couldn't, how can they expect the citizens to do it? And so there was an interesting reflection. Another one was about transparency. There is a lot of push of transparency, but then there are problems of data protection. So one of the games that we do, we assign a role with a person who is or transgender or really old. So when we show the engagement statistics at the end, we de-anonymize this person because it's the only one above 85. And so you know how they voted. So this we use to teach GDPR, it's the privacy law in Europe, and how the fact you have to pay attention. So the trade-off, like you have to be very careful about transparency. Then there are other more complex lessons about transparency. Sometimes maybe it's better to be less transparent, so on and so forth. But yeah, so that would be my recommendation for researcher style individuals. Because it talks about the history of participatory budgeting, the mutation. It has a little bit of nostalgia of the good old days that makes no sense because it's really unfeasible to do those things. But it's still, I think, helpful to understand what it could be too. Like really, and it's not alone. A lot of us think about participatory budgeting within participatory budgeting. Instead, it should always be a device for for a larger political project. Otherwise, it becomes self-referential. I think it really misses the point.
Well, thank you so much.